Welcome back to the channel. Today, the escape of Sir Sidney Smith. Okay, so a little bit of a tangent, just to start off with, get it out of the way. This is something I've literally just found out about. Not the escape of Sir Sidney Smith, I knew about that. But I was looking into doing a video about the early part of the Napoleonic Wars, because the later stuff, you know, Waterloo and the Spanish and all that nonsense, everyone sort of has a grasp of that, and that sort of gets talked about a lot. But maybe the Battle of the Pyramids, that was what I went and I looked at. The first place I go is Wikipedia, because you just get bang, 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 then you delve deeper. But, you know, Battle of the Pyramids, yeah, it's not that interesting. Napoleon basically forms squares and then slaughters a whole bunch of these Mamelukes and destroys their whole grasp of Egypt, blah, blah, blah. And then I went, okay, go down the bottom. The Siege of Acre. Siege of Acre is really interesting. After the fall of Jaffa, Napoleon slaughters thousands of prisoners, murders them. Siege of Acre is really cool. And then I saw a name I hadn't ever seen before. Philippeu, I'm not French. Phil's, I'll put it's on the screen. He's very important. Philippe is what I'm going to say when I mean this, okay? And I've never seen it, so I clicked on the thing, and he was instrumental in the Siege of Acre, moving cannons around. I won't go into that. But I found out he was one of the key people to bust Sir Sidney Smith out of prison. And then that'll be the video. How did Sir Sidney Smith get out of prison? Did a bit of searching, and I came across the Journal of the Historical Association, which is a peer-reviewed academic journal. Ended up being a student. I can access these things hidden behind paywalls. Sorry it's so long an intro, but I want to set this up right. So what I'm going to tell you now is not some quack conspiracy theory nonsense. This is in a peer-reviewed journal written by in an article called "The British Secret Service and the Escape of Sir Sidney Smith from Paris in 1798" by Michael Durry from the Murdoch University here in Australia, in Perth. I didn't know that until after I'd read the article, that it was actually from Murdoch University. Anyway, he's a very famous Australian newspaperman. His family still today own quite a few newspapers. Anyway, Murdoch University here in Australia. So, who is Sir Sidney Smith? Well, I've just got some notes here, and I've just got Smith introduce. So I will. Sir Sidney Smith was a British naval officer. Those of you who've gone over to Beasts of War and you know me from on Tabletop know that my flagship in my Dark Star fleet is called the Swedish Knight, and that's named after Sir Sidney Smith. Sir Sidney Smith was called the Swedish Knight because he was a Swedish knight. He was a British naval officer. He had fought in the American War of Independence for the British, of course. Got all the way up. There was peace. He fought for the Swedes against the Russians, where he royally curb-stomped the Russians, something brutal. Keep that in mind, because the guy who actually organized the... Okay, so he curb-stomps the Russians bad, like 60 ships lost to like 5 or something. He really brutally destroys the Russian fleet. And a lot of British officers are actually serving on the Russian fleet. And the reason a lot of them are serving there is because one of the guys who's key to breaking him out is actually key to organizing them fighting for the Russians. This espionage gets really messy and tangled up. So Sidney Smith does that, comes back home, and as far as we're concerned, the biggest point we need to say here is that at the Siege of Toulon, where some guy named Napoleon was besieging Toulon, Sir Sidney Smith just rocked up with a bunch of dudes, Spanish, Portuguese, some British, just Frenchmen, just guys. This private citizen who just happened to have a naval commission but was not on active service, Sir Sidney Smith, who was not a British knight. He would become one, but he was not now. He just rocked up and said, "Hello, Lord Hood, Admiral Lord Hood. I would like a job, please." And Lord Hood went, "Well, I can't just give you a job, but you can do these things for me." And so he sort of did a few tasks for Lord Hood, one of which was to burn the entire French fleet at Le Havre. And Smith did this. Smith burned half the French fleet at Le Havre. Most people blame the Spanish with him, because the Spanish get blamed for everything in the Napoleonic Wars, because frankly they deserve it. The Spanish are not really good allies to have at all. They're quite inept at stuff, but anyway. Half the French fleet is burned, so Sidney Smith is a hero. He makes himself a bitter enemy of Napoleon. He would actually cement that theory 3 years later, the Battle of Acre. Toulon is 96, sorry. At the Battle of Acre, Napoleon would basically blame Sir Sidney Smith for him missing his destiny, and Philippe, he would also say, was the one responsible for him losing the campaign in the Orient by his repositioning of cannons. Because Napoleon blames everyone except himself for his own mistakes. Anyway, tangent. So Sir Sidney Smith has burned half the French fleet at Toulon. And Sir Sidney Smith is an enemy of Napoleon. He's a British naval officer. He's also the go-between man for the British intelligence network in France. Bit of a bombshell. So it turns out that the British had actually set up quite a sophisticated intelligence network between Switzerland, the Channel Islands, London, and royalist elements in France. And the guy who was basically being the go-between between the British heads of the intelligence and the French men on the ground was Sir Sidney Smith. He would ferry agents across. He actually had his secretary was actually an agent. He was a Frenchman who he claimed was a French-Canadian, and Smith knew all this. Sir Sidney Smith would constantly put him ashore and pick him up a few weeks later. As in, Sir Sidney Smith would get in a rowboat with a bunch of men and row him to shore, and he would personally do this. And he would always just make up an excuse like, well, it's a simple rowing mission, I need to stretch my legs, so to speak, so you, First Lieutenant, you take over the ship and I'll row, really breaking naval tradition, but he wanted to run the ops, so Sir Sidney Smith was in charge of all that. Fluent French speaker, very well versed in the language. Lord Grenville had set up, he was a big wig in the British government, not a Whig, I think he was a Tory, but anyway, it doesn't matter, he was important in the British government, it's not important to the story that much. Lord Grenville had set up a spy network, and he was basically personally organising this giant spy network. And Sir Sidney Smith was running the whole thing from his ship. And the Admiralty was aware that Sir Sidney Smith was doing some work for the Foreign Secretary or the Foreign Affairs Office. I don't know what the British call it. He was doing some work for the Foreign Service of the British government. And but they didn't really know what. The Admiralty had its own intelligence. It was pretty crap. But so they knew Smith was up to something. And this is the author sort of says here, this may be the reason some naval officers really didn't like Sir Sidney Smith. Collingwood didn't like Sir Sidney Smith, Lord Collingwood, and Lord Nelson really didn't like Smith either. And maybe him being a secret spy was part of the reason they didn't like him. Anyway, a lot of the men on Sir Sidney's ship, as in the sailors and the Marines and that sort of thing, were also French expatriates, French royalists, French anti-republicans, French anti-Jacobins, French anti-people who happen to be in power this week, because as we'll see later, these coups just keep on rolling through, and the government changes overnight in some places. This is pre-Napoleon becoming first consul, pre-empire. This is just revolutions. It's a few years after the French Revolution. It's still a republic. If you can call what the French did a republic, which is basically just executing people for no reason, it was called the Terror. For a reason. It would eventually end up with Robespierre basically going on this psychotic speech rampage thing and blowing his own head off, but missing. Anyway, the French went downhill quick during the Revolution. So it's when I say republic, Republican, royalist, Republican basically just means in favour of the French government at the time. Royalist just means not in favour of the French government at the time. Anyway. So, on the 17th of April, 1796, Smith was tasked with taking down the Vengeur. The Vengeur, again, I don't speak French. The Vengeur was a privateer, which means it was a privately owned ship, given a letter of marque by it might have been called something else at this time, but in the earlier period it was called a letter of marque, which essentially means the piracy you commit against faction X is perfectly legitimate and the French government will stand by it. So, essentially, you're acting on behalf of the French state when you attack the British. Or you could issue a letter of marque, say, to the Spanish, but not against the British, or British would offer these too, so against maybe the Americans, but not against the French, when we get into the War of 1812 type thing. So yeah, although the British did far less than because they just didn't need to, they had the Navy. But so there's a privateer really giving the British shipping trouble. And so Sidney Smith is sent to deal with this privateer, but that is believed to be a cover. So the real reason that he's supposed to be in this area is to pick up a spy. The spy is actually quite important in the story, but he's not quite important in the story. He's involved in the story, but he's basically involved with Sir Sidney Smith at every step of the stage, so I'm not even going to bother mentioning him. His name is Wright, for those who want to know. That's his alias, but Yeah, basically when I say Sir Sidney Smith, it should be Sir Sidney Smith and Wright, but that's just going to be tedious. Anyway, so Smith himself makes up a lie about his first lieutenant being sick and the second lieutenant just not being able to be found on a ship. I don't know. Anyway. And goes after the voyeur, and there's a gap. There's a gap where no one knows what happened, which is basically when Sir Sidney Smith went and picked this guy up, and then he himself with guys in a jolly boat went and picked him up. He sent the ship back with the flammable material, which would have been used to burn down the voyeur, because the voyeur had spotted him engaged in like a musket duel. They cut their anchor rope and basically abandoned the ship, and by the time Sir Sidney had took it over, it was just floating downstream in front of a whole bunch of French forts, and he was forced to surrender. So Sir Sidney Smith was then taken into custody. He was taken to the Abbey, it's got 2 B's, anyway, prison, but he was then quickly transferred to the Temple prison, and charged as a private citizen and an arsonist. Napoleon had a big part in this. Napoleon hated him, and Napoleon really, really pushed for him to be tried as an arsonist. But the British basically said, well, if we want to start, he is a member of the Royal Navy, and even though he wasn't on active service, he had written orders from Admiral Lord Hood. So, you want to start messing with our guys, we'll start messing with your guys. And he was basically just locked up in the Temple. In the Temple prison, sorry. And generally what you did was you wrote to the commander and you exchanged a prisoner exchange. And Lord Grenville was actually ridiculously keen to get Sir Sidney Smith out of prison. Because with Sir Sidney Smith in prison, the network had no go-between. The network was blind and deaf, essentially. The French couldn't coordinate with the British, and the British wouldn't really coordinate with the French. They could still talk to one another, but it was nowhere near as efficient as when Sir Sidney was running it. So he wanted that man back. Also, the longer Sir Sidney Smith was in prison, the more likely it was that someone would actually rat on him, and someone did try and rat on him. The French broke up a spy ring, and actually had a letter from Sir Sidney to one of the spies who was meant to pass it on, and he basically handed this over to get save his own skin. But it was written in a cipher, and they couldn't prove that it was Sir Sidney, even though they knew. So that charge never stuck. But Grenville was very keen to get Sir Sidney out. He even earmarked £1,000 to the effort of getting Sir Sidney out of prison. And keep in mind, the average wage of a farmer or a labourer in this period is about £20 to £30 a year. So there was a lot of money stoked away, and it's estimated that about £10,000 was used to break Sir Sidney out of prison. We're getting ahead of ourselves, though. So Sidney Smith is in prison. Who's the cap? Okay, so they have a guy called Bergeret, Captain Bergeret, who was captured by Sir Edward Pellew. One of my other Dark Star ships is called HMS Pellew, after Captain Pellew. Those of you who've seen the Hornblower series will be familiar with Captain Pellew. Anyway, he's irrelevant apart from that. I just want to throw that in. So they have Bergeret. And Bergeret's actually given parole a bunch of times to go to Paris to actually approach the directorate, or it keeps changing. It goes from, there's one group in charge of Sir Sidney Smith, and then it's like, well, no, it's been transferred to the Navy. So they go to the Navy, it's like, well, no, it's actually been transferred to the Marine Department in general. So they go to the Marine Department, and it's like, no, it's actually been transferred back to just the entire thing as a whole. So they go and talk to them, and then they keep getting bounced around. So Bergeret is sent a couple of times to basically say, hey, look, I really want to be free. Can you please just hand that officer over? But the French were actually very reluctant, because they had figured out who Sir Sidney Smith was. They knew he was a spy. They knew he was some kind of spy. They couldn't prove it, and they didn't know what kind of spy that he was. Maybe he was an unwitting, maybe he was like the go-between man, but he just didn't know it. They knew he was involved in dodgy stuff. So the amount of power that Grenville had was extreme. Grenville actually, at one point, there was a peace negotiations between, his name was Malmesbury, Earl of Malmesbury, was basically in charge of the British negotiations with the French for a peace agreement. And the first point on his list was actually put there by Lord Grenville, which was, Sir Sidney Smith is to be released immediately, or we will cancel the parole of all French naval officers. Which was basically a nuclear bomb, saying, if you don't friggin' give us back Sir Sidney Smith in fair exchange for a French naval officer, we will basically imprison, the same way you have imprisoned Sir Sidney Smith, we will imprison all of your naval officers. Because at the time, of course, you could just give your parole and just live in a hotel somewhere and walk around the streets and be part of society, which is why Sir Sidney Smith's treatment was so bizarre, because he was locked up. Through bribes, he was able to actually walk around the streets for a few hours, but nowhere near what a normal parole officer would have been like. It was extremely irregular for this to happen. Malmesbury really didn't push this hard enough. He sort of brought it up, and then when the French said, "Oh, yeah, do it, go ahead," he backed down, whereas Grenville was more than happy to actually go through with this, because he really wanted his intelligence guy back. Malmesbury didn't know that Sir Sidney Smith was involved in the intelligence. Malmesbury's staff did. He had members of his staff who were actually part of the intelligence themselves. And they managed to actually get inside Temple Prison and talk to him. And another one of them managed to actually coordinate a few people around the Temple Prison, sort of living nearby. And they went, okay, well, can we do this? Can we do this? Do you know of anyone who might be able to help? And they sort of laid the groundwork, but it didn't go anywhere. Malmesbury actually ended up saying something very similar to this quote, so I'll read it out to you now. The French have attached a much higher political value to this officer than he deserves. So Malmesbury sort of figured out that, why is Sir Sidney Smith being treated differently to someone else? Why do the French really want this guy to be kept in prison? So he had caught on. And by 97, the British have pretty much used all their channels up. They have no real political channels left to go down. They've tried everything they're legally allowed to do and supposed to do. But the British had actually been doing dodgy stuff since day one. Since the moment Sir Sidney Smith was there. The moment Sir Sidney Smith was arrested, the entire intelligence network was basically put on red alert to get him out. So he had actually made... There were some women who lived across the road from the Abbey prison, and he called anyway, that ended up going nowhere, and then he's actually being bankrolled by Philip Pugh. Philip Pugh is actually using his own money to bribe the guards to give Sir Sidney Smith access to other prisoners. He was kept in solitary along with Wright. So Smith, he was being bribed. The guards were all being bribed to give him extra food and all this sort of stuff. Okay, so let's have a look at Philip Pugh. Philip Pugh was a French artillery officer who graduated at the same time as Napoleon, and by that I mean Philip Pugh's number was 41 and Napoleon's number was 42. They literally were in the same class, and Philip Pugh just happened to receive his certificate before Napoleon Bonaparte. His father had fled to Britain when the revolution started, and Philip Pugh ended up fleeing to Britain as well. He set himself up as this sort of... he was an aristocrat of some kind, so he set himself up as this sort of moneyed man who was into doing anything to free France. And so he went back and set himself up with his... the Chevaliers of they call themselves the Chevaliers, these sort of French knights who ran this underground network in this very lax part of the country where the French government was really not cracking down. They basically said, well, if you surrender and promise us that you're not going to do anything, we'll let you live here. And anyway, that's an entire different story that I don't have time to go into. So Philip Pugh is basically financing a giant chunk of the escape attempt for Sir Sidney Smith. The thing that started now, Philip Pugh was not actually in charge of any escape attempt at Sir Sidney Smith. The reason Philip Pugh himself was actually in prison at this point. At this point of the story, Philip Pugh is in prison, and Philip Pugh was busted out by two people, Boisgard, a dancer in the opera, and Jean Neuville, who were a part of the escape attempt, but they just fade into sort of like background characters at this point. Philip Pugh is really the guy in charge, along with some guys we're going to meet later. So Philip Pugh gets busted out of prison, and then the Paris agency gets hit, and the Paris agency was the main intelligence network in Paris. And the big three get thrown in the Temple prison right alongside Sir Sidney Smith, and so the British intelligence agency then goes, we really, really, really need to get those guys out of prison, because if they turn, we're really screwed. So they put Philip Pugh onto this, and eventually Sir Sidney Smith had actually established basically an intelligence network inside the Temple prison. And so they were able to contact him using bribes, and they basically coordinated an escape attempt. And the escape attempt was literally something out of Wile E. Coyote. They were literally just going to tunnel under the prison and dig up into the exercise yard, and then they'd run through this tunnel. But you can't just dig tunnels, and it collapsed on them, and some guys were injured, but they all managed to get out, and they're all in one piece. And after the tunnel attempt failed, then there was a coup, and the two of the guys in the prison, two of the three, were sent to Africa. They were sent to an African prison. And one of them was released because he had ratted, and his ratting killed a lot of British agents and threw a lot of the spy network into complete disarray, which is what the British were afraid of. And after these big three Paris agency guys were out of the prison, they weren't really that eager to get Sir Sidney out. It was still a priority of Lord Grenville, but the wider intelligence agency was sort of like a little standoffish to start messing too much with the French, because they didn't want to. You can understand why you don't want to do brazen, open stuff like this, because it'll just invite stuff to happen to you. So it's gone from bust out the big three, and then Sir Sidney just happens to be in there, so let's get him out as well, to Sir Sidney Smith has to get out of this prison. They try negotiations with the new government. It basically just goes, the exact same thing happens. Anyway. So, with Sir Sidney Smith being the basically go-between man, and their main Paris agency guys in prison or ratting on them or in Africa, the British intelligence, which was very informal, like it wasn't like MI6 or whatever, this is just a group of guys, but it was well organized, but it was not like a government department type deal as we have today. Anyway, they contacted the Navy. They finally got in contact with the Navy, and they said, can we use your ghetto-ass piece of garbage intelligence agency, please, because we really are that desperate. And they managed to get a hold of Richard Cadman Etches. Cadman is a good name for him because he was quite the cad. A cad is like a rake, a scoundrel, a dastardly gentleman type figure, an aristocratic, like a flashman type. Flashman is the ultimate cad. Those of you who don't know who Flashman is, stop this immediately, go read some Flashman, and then you'll know what I'm talking about. Anyway. Etches was actually working he was a Dane who was working for the Russians. He was the one who actually coordinated the British officers to fight for the Russian Navy. So he was Smith's enemy at one point, but now they're on the same side. And Etches was running an incredibly elaborate scheme in France, which was, it's incredibly complicated, but essentially he was a standover man for a whole bunch of criminal activities. He was also shaking down foreign diplomats, which is bizarre. And he was using the shakedown money, right? He was laundering his shakedown money and criminal money by buying government bonds through Talleyrand, among many others. Talleyrand was actually a minor guy who was only barely involved with the Portuguese. But it was this Portuguese minister who got him in trouble, and Etches ended up himself in the Temple prison. And he then became the main financier because he wanted to get himself out and the other guys. So yeah, the Navy's ghetto-ass operator was also now in the prison. It's a prison attempt from the inside out, people. But before Etches got in prison, he did manage to get into the hands of the Royalists a crucial document. What was on the document? Well, there were two things. There was a very fancy letterhead and border from the French Marine Department. And at the bottom of the document, a completely blank document, except for this official letterhead and official, everything official, was the signature of a French minister. The name is given, he's totally irrelevant. I've never heard of this guy before, so he is given, basically he knew a clerk or bribed a clerk who basically said, oh, boss, could you just sign this before you leave, because I'll stay behind and fill out all the paperwork, but I need your signature because I've got to get this done by tomorrow. So he's just signed it and then sold this to Etches for quite a sum of money. And what they do with it is they forge a prisoner transfer for Sir Sidney Smith, Wright, Etches, and a few other people. So they forge a transfer sheet. So rather than tunneling under the prison, all they have to do is get some revolutionary uniforms and just walk up and take the prisoners away. And this is exactly what they did. On the 23rd of April, 1797, remember Sir Sidney Smith was captured on the 18th of April, 96. So pretty much a week and a year after he was captured, he broke out of jail. Two men walked up, dressed as revolutionary soldiers, and handed this letter. Please bring us these prisoners. We're taking them to another prison. Okay, it's all official. Transferred the prisoners out. They put them in a carriage and immediately just ran. They actually toppled the carriage at one point and injured a little girl, the escape story is very dramatic, but it doesn't pay off. So I suppose they're just fleeing and they topple a carriage, injure a little girl, hide out in a hotel. They get back to the coast where they charter for £35, an exorbitant fee to just go a little bit out to sea. They charter a fisherman who actually recognises Sidney Smith it's never explained why, but this fisherman, for some reason, knew him. Had still bilked him for everything he was worth. Rowed him out to a waiting British warship. And then the British sent ashore the French naval officer and said, well, there you go, fair deal's a fair deal. Thanks for the prisoner exchange, and just went home. Now, if you wanted to... the Bergeret, sorry, the French captain. Anyway, if you wanted to know about how Sidney Smith escaped from prison, there you go, I've just told you. Now, if you want to hear the aftermath of this, and the sort of trail on, stay watching. So Sidney Smith himself, being a prime intelligence operative, this is the reason this is not really well known. There actually, the paper talks about several books that have been written about Sidney Smith who just don't have access to this information because it's such a niche topic. And I'm not, it's obviously, this is a almost 20-year-old journal, almost 20-year-old article, peer-reviewed in a journal. So I'm not like finding new information and the secrets of everything. But it's not common knowledge that Sir Sidney Smith was this involved with intelligence. And as someone who was very involved with the intelligence, the first thing he did was lie. So when he busted out, he spread rumours that it was 100% the French royalists. There were no British involvement whatsoever. And it was a spur-of-the-moment decision. A bunch of French royalists just busted him out of jail. He didn't know them. He didn't know who they were. But thanks very much for busting me out of prison. The papers which were pro his whatever political affiliation he was were basically like, oh, look at this. This is a good story. And the papers which were against him were sort of like, that doesn't make sense. And eventually the one that came closest was the Times, who said that there had to have been British involvement in this. There was absolutely no way he got out of that prison without British involvement. But luckily for Sidney Smith, who had even written letters to his own parents saying it was all French, it was all the French, I knew a couple of people involved, but it was all French. Luckily for Sir Sidney Smith, the Irish managed to kick off their nonsense in 98 with Wolfe Tone and his lot. No, I'm not going to go on a tangent about how they were mostly Protestants and the whole Protestant Catholic thing in Ireland is a sort of British modern transfer. Irish republicanism was not a Catholic thing when it was invented. It transformed into one because the British really desperately wanted it to become a religious thing. To break it away, because they were... I'm not going to go into it. The Irish kicked off their stuff in 98 and... that transferred attention away from Sir Sidney Smith. And Sir Sidney Smith would then go on. So, Philip Hugh, his story is not over yet because he plays a very crucial role in the Siege of Accra. Maybe I'll make a video on the Siege of Accra. It's very interesting. It's like it's the thing that it and the Battle of the Nile really stumped Napoleon in Egypt. They're the two things that really mess him up. And basically, Philip Hugh at Accra is responsible for taking all of Napoleon's guns, which Sir Sidney Smith had kindly given to him by bombarding the sea road and scattering the French away from their own guns. And so Philip Hugh took these guns and built an extra set of walls, barricades and defensive positions inside the walls of Accra, set all these guns up facing the sea, and defended Accra. And Napoleon was furious that this guy had done this. He was furious that Philippe had manned these guns on the walls. But Philippe tragically died in 99, right after the Siege of Accra, of heat stroke or of fever in the desert, or some. So he died of sort of natural causes in Egypt somewhere. So that's the story of the escape of Sir Sidney Smith from the Temple Prison in 1797. Sir Sidney Smith would go on to do a whole bunch more stuff. Very, very famous guy. He was the one who got the Portuguese royal family out of Lisbon. He did a whole bunch of stuff. He was a very strong anti-slavery advocate. He took a whole bunch of guys. He just rocked up at Waterloo for some reason. He just was near Waterloo and happened to run into them. Part of his intelligence work was also to coordinate Italian partisans in the sort of mid-Napoleonic wars in the sort of 1804-ish period, 05-ish period. He coordinated Italian partisans there, and his work inspired General Wellesley, Sir Arthur Wellington. So Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington, sorry, it's a long video. Anyway, his work with the partisans basically inspired Sir Arthur Wellesley, who would then use his method of coordination would eventually be used by Wellesley's intelligence operatives in the peninsula to coordinate with the Portuguese and Spanish guerrillas. So yeah, a very important guy, very big figure in history who because a lot of the stuff he's done was so clandestine, and at that time period there weren't people writing these massive memoir books about these spies and all this sort of stuff. It's sort of hidden, to the point where I literally found out about this today, and after a few hours of research I've decided to make this video. So maybe I will look into a bit more into the intelligence aspect of the Napoleonic period. I know that the British have a very famous intelligence colonel who is running Wellington's intelligence, who ends up, he gets captured, escapes, and he just runs the intelligence from Paris Cafe pretending to be an American. He's a badass, that guy. Anyway, so thank you very, very much for watching this long video. And let me know in the comments below if you would like anything explained. Maybe I'll go over the Napoleonic cipher, the Napoleonic code for how the different armies encoded their messages, because you have to, prior to computers, you can't encode things too well. Anyway, so thank you very much for watching, and have a wonderful day.